I'm joined now by former Ambassador Leela K Ponappa and Chidanand Rajghatta, US correspondent at the Times of India. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. Ambassador Ponappa, let me begin by just getting your take on what is happening vis-a-vis the current situation, because it's changing so fast. In the last 24 hours, it seems as if the level of escalation has cooled down. Would that be the right perception?
Well, sitting here in India, I think it would be, one can sort of take a guess in terms of actually what is happening. And really one has to depend on ground reports and not just on reporting from other capitals. But having said that, I think very clearly there's some extreme brinkmanship going on. As you rightly pointed out, the sanctions that were announced yesterday are highly calibrated, personalized, if you will, 3 billionaires here, the Duma members there, and so on. And equally, I think the Russians, Putin in particular, has been going full tilt in terms of media exposure and seems to, having set out the three major conditions that he talked about, and claims that he's still open to a diplomatic solution. How it's going to move, it would be difficult to project at this point of time, but the sense one gets is that, yes, there is inching forward in terms of belligerence and confrontation, but we will have to see whether both sides will pull back or not, or at least try to seek a middle ground.
Chidanand, like Madam Ambassador said, sitting here in India, we're pretty much seeing a very strident tone from the Biden administration, but more talk than action so far. Is there a sense now dawning that Washington is not that keen to push the envelope beyond these sanctions, which are being seen as more of a slap on the wrist?
Well, the tactic here was, to be shrill right from the get-go and to try and, get Putin to back off simply by the volume of rhetoric and also copious leaked intelligence about how, Russian troops are massed across the border and all his plans. I mean, it was an hour-by-hour leak. The problem with that is U.S. credibility is not very high after what happened in Iraq and then Afghanistan. So they had trouble selling that, and there's also no domestic consensus. In the domestic polity in the U.S., there are the militarists who are always ready for war. They need an enemy. And they're isolationists, mainly the Trump crowd, which don't care. They want the Europeans to handle the Ukraine problem. So they began shrilly, and it's only now they're calibrating. And the word out of here is that the sanctions will be graduated. If Putin pushes further, then there'll be more sanctions and so on. So they're trying to contain it. Essentially, the reason you refer to the markets, the reason why markets are rising again here is simply the sense that both sides will try and navigate and finesse their way out of this. As you saw yesterday, there was a lot of discussion on whether it is an invasion or the beginning of an invasion.
Right.
So there are all these, nuances. So the sense one gets it, that they will not go to the extreme. For instance, why would Putin want to capture all of Ukraine? And the western parts of Ukraine are more European. They want, and the young of Ukraine want, to be a Western-style democracy. So you don't want to take over an entire country and risk an insurgency. So the sense is Putin will be happy with the two provinces and a bit more maybe. And here they want to draw the line somewhere because if they let this go too long and too far, you never know what he might demand next in Poland or other countries. So yeah, there is a lot of finessing going on. That's the sense I get. They're hoping that Putin won't push it. Sanctions are really, by now we know that sanctions don't work simply because countries in their national interest, suck it up. Iran, North Korea, there's so many countries which have been sanctioned, which survive. Somehow it hurts them, but they survive. Nobody's going to sacrifice their self-interest.
That's actually the sense. That's actually the statement which came in from Russia yesterday, right, that sanctions don't make any difference to us. Today they're saying it's going to hurt the United States more. I just want to switch for a second to the Indian perspective, and let me come to Ambassador Ponappa on this point. We've kept a steady distance so far. We've not gotten drawn into the conflict. Can we manage that now for long enough? And perhaps if the situation stays like this, we can. But what if it takes a turn for the worse?
Good question. And of course, this is something that everybody's trying to figure out. The media reporting the statements that have been made in the UN and by the foreign minister in Paris yesterday as saying that India is pussyfooting around. I think one has to recognize that at the end of the day, every country, and certainly India and other countries, work in the national interest. Our diplomacy is after India's national interests. Now, you get people saying, well, you've got to choose between Russia and the United States. And I would question that. Do you have to? Let's take a look at US policy itself. At a time when terrorism was rife, they had a certain equation with Pakistan, but they also decided that it was in their interest to develop a certain interest with India. And the whole point, the thrust of India's diplomacy at that time was stop triangulating the relationship. So regardless of what America did in Afghanistan, for better or for worse, and the development of the partnership with India, not an alliance, but a partnership, have really followed two different tracks. Likewise, I think in terms of the kind of dialogue that India has had with the United States I would say over the past couple of decades, and really the strength of this relationship, which has a very firm understanding of our common geopolitical interests in the Indo-Pacific. I think the scope for triangulation is something that we should really not accept. And thus far, we have managed it. Equally, without necessarily pointing fingers, Dr. Jaishankar has spoken about India's commitment to territorial integrity and such like. But I would also like to point out one thing, and this is really the lessons of history. For all the talk about, force multipliers and high tech and so on and so forth, ultimately the bottom line is the balance of power. Who has what capacity? What will they do in terms of the red lines that they draw? If you recall in 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba. John F. Kennedy drew a red line and he took a position. And the situation ultimately resolved itself. If you heard Putin on TV over the past couple of days, he has drawn his red lines. And here I would really like to focus on the NATO aspect. The whole business of the erstwhile East European countries joining NATO has been under discussion really from the mid-2000s. And the sensitivities of Russia with regard to Georgia or the Ukraine joining NATO have been well known. Just reflect, it's a hypothetical position, but if Mexico were to join the Warsaw Pact, what would the US reaction be?
Or Canada.
Well, I won't even name Canada, but let's or Canada.
No, absolutely.
As it happens, Cuba was never a member of the Warsaw Pact, but it was part of the Comecon. But the red lines came into operation when the missiles were placed. It's a different matter that those missiles were preceded by American missiles in Turkey. That's a different story if you read Dobrynen's account of his in Washington. But, there are certain situations which, as Putin defined Russia's national interest, he said are non-negotiable and are unacceptable. India too has in different circumstances defined its red lines, but here it is very clear of what Russia will accept. They want the West to accept the annexation of Crimea. And again, if you go back to history, the area that constitutes Ukraine, that constitutes Crimea, it's been a football. And as late as 1954, Crimea was part of the Russian Federation, the republic under Russia, and it was then transferred to Ukraine in 1954. So it's a very complex situation.
Clearly, this is a complex situation. These are long-standing issues, but we've been tracking this on a regular basis because it's been impacting global markets so heavily, and it's important to kind of understand what's going on. So the takeaway right now is no major escalation, more talk, over the last 24 hours, but no major escalation so far. We'll have to wait and see if this situation holds. I'll have to end it here, but thank you so much, Chidanand Rajghatta and Ambassador Ponappa, for speaking with us today.